Yeah, it's obviously it's an important aspect of what we do. It's an important aspect of our purchase sale agreements that buyers have that option to do an inspection. And actually, one of the things we're seeing a lot of is sellers trying to steer buyers toward certain inspectors or away from certain inspectors. I'm going to start by saying don't do that if you're a seller. The reason that we want the buyer to have an inspection is to give them, the buyer, the option to check out the property to the extent that they want to with their own professionals. It avoids an accusation at the end of the transaction to say, well, look, we didn't know about this, or you didn't tell us this, or the guy that you told us to go find didn't tell us this. So let buyers make their own choices in that regard. But I think probably the biggest thing that we're seeing out there is just the flow as to how it works and the steps and the process. We all know there's a buyer's inspection contingency out there. Buyer makes suggested changes to the seller on the RE10, then what happens? And that's probably where the biggest questions come up. So what that looks like is, the buyer sends over an RE10, the seller looks at it, the seller can agree and say, yes, these are all fine, these are things I agree to fix, and they sign off on it, and everybody's happy. That's not usually complex. Or the seller could come back and say, nope, I'm not doing any of the above, and the buyer is fine with that. Those aren't complex. What gets complex is when there is a bit of negotiation that happens in between those two circumstances. And the thing that's important to note is that all of the responses that go back and forth, once a buyer provides seller with an RE10, that's irrevocable. So seller gets their 3 business days to look at that and decide what they're going to do. Then again, same thing. Once seller does respond, he goes back to buyer and says, well, I'm not going to fix items 1, 2, but I'll fix item 3. That is also irrevocable. So then it goes back into buyer's, the ball is back in buyer's court, and buyer has their 3 business days to do anything that's, they get to make their choices, as we all know in the section 4 of that particular part of the RE21. The buyer has the ability to just terminate at that point and say, well, I'm not going to go through with this transaction. Or buyer can, they can try to negotiate with seller. Buyer can also just, agree to proceed without any changing. But the real tricky part comes with that irrevocable. During that process, as they're negotiating, buyer always has the ability to go back and pick up seller's irrevocable response and say, okay, I'll do that. You agreed to do number 3, I'm signing it, and away we go.